to United Airlines, they based me in Boston, a really expensive city to live in. And I started off on my flying career, and my parents were not necessarily really happy with me because I had just been through this really expensive liberal arts school to become a teacher. And so I was on my own, and we had no paying, and we're not paid during training. So here I am, I get an apartment with 7 other women who were my classmates and start off on my flying career. And so about 3 or 4 weeks in, my roommates got their first paycheck. And I was so excited to call my bank account, and there was just $12 in the bank account. So I went into the office, I said, somebody's gotta help me, I didn't get my first paycheck. And the person behind the desk said, oh, well, you get your first paycheck at different times for different reasons, we're sure you get it next time. And I'm thinking, all right, cool your jets, Sarah, you're on probation, you're supposed to not cause a ruckus. And I prayed for some reserve assignments as a flight attendant. That's when you're waiting to get work, waiting by the phone to get work, so that I could eat plain food. Had a lot of top ramen. Maybe had a couple dates. That was steak and lobster for sure. But made it through to the next payday, and the day before I was coming off a reserve assignment, and in Boston the hotel van drivers would take the crew to the hotel, and then they would drive us who lived in Boston home to our apartment. So we did, and it was customary to give the van driver $1 when you get off the van as they hand you your bag. And I only had a quarter. It was my last quarter on earth. And I gave him the quarter, mortified. Went into the apartment, nobody else was home, there was nothing in the cupboard. So the next day, while I'm waiting for the paycheck to drop, I jump-seated to Chicago and back so I could eat some more plain food. And when I landed back in Boston, checked my bank account, and now it's 0. Nothing there. So I'm at the airport, I go down into the company office, and again said, somebody's gotta help me. I didn't get a paycheck. And they said, oh yeah, well, you get your paycheck at different times for different reasons. I'm like, oh my God. And so the first time I really understood what it meant to be a number. And I felt like that's all I was in some HR file. Mm-hmm. And so I started to get a little emotional, and the tears started to roll. And I said, you gotta help me. And all of a sudden I had this tap on the shoulder that changed everything, because I turned around and there was someone standing there who looked just like me. I'd never seen her before otherwise, but she was wearing her uniform and her union pin and asking me how to spell my name. And she handed me a check for $800, and she said, number 1, you go take care of yourself, and number 2, you call our union. And I did call our union. I had my paycheck the very next day, but I always say that I learned everything I need to know about our labor movement in that moment when she was standing in front of me. Mm-hmm. Because I learned that as a union member, we can fight for each other in a way that we can never fight for ourselves alone. And in our unions, we are never alone. So the other thing that happened when I first started flying was that my very first trip, a very senior flight attendant got into a little argument with the supervisor in the office before we left on the trip. She ended up winning, but it was a bit of a conflict, and she pulls me aside afterwards and she said, listen, management thinks of us as their wives or their mistresses, and in either case, they hold us in contempt. Your only place of worth is with your fellow flying partners, and if we stick together, there's nothing we can't accomplish. And so I'm going to tell you, if we stick together, there's nothing we can't accomplish. Now, our job as flight attendants was first formed because a woman who was a pilot tried to get an airline to hire her. She loved flying. She wanted to be a pilot. And the company said, every company she went to said, no, women are too emotional, so you can't be a pilot. And so she said, well, she didn't give up. And she advocated that they needed to have women in the cabin to take care of the men who were going to be feeble in the air, because it's a traumatic experience to fly at that time. And so the women needed to be there, the emotional women needed to be there to take care of the men. And they bought it. And so our profession was formed. But very early on, courageous women who were in this job formed our union, and they formed it to beat back discrimination that ranged from quitting at age 30 or when you're pregnant or stepping on a weight scale until 1993. And we even fought for men to have the same rights on the job as women. You're welcome for those of you men, courageous men in the room. But we always thought that no one was ever going to take care of us. We had to organize, and we had to define our own path, our own role. And we did that. And so when the Me Too movement broke, and I said to my staff, now listen, we're going to start getting calls. And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, the media is looking around and they're saying, who can we talk to about getting sexually harassed on the job? Oh, gee, flight attendants. And sure enough, the phone started to ring. And so I was able to tell my stories. I was able to talk about the time when I was setting up the galley and somebody came up behind me, a man came up behind me and touched me on the side of my rear end and said, what, no girdle? How do you look that good in your uniform without a girdle? But that is just the tip of the iceberg. So I could tell my stories, but I wanted to see if this was still the experience of flight attendants. And so I got out in the crew rooms and started talking to flight attendants and saying, what's happening now? What are you experiencing on the job? And we put out a call for people to send in their stories, and we actually conducted a survey where we collected comments and we got a real assessment of the level of sexual harassment still going on the job. And so when I got into those crew rooms and we would have these conversations, I would say, does this still happen? And, oh yeah, that happens. Well, what do you do when someone makes a comment or when someone reaches out their hand inappropriately? What do you do? And they say, oh, we tell them to stop it, behave themselves, whatever. I said, really, do you do that every time? And then the real conversations started. And from 6 months on the job to 40 years on the job, I got similar stories. And they said, well, not always, because we're also there to take care of everyone on the plane, and we have to de-escalate issues. And sometimes I decide quickly about that exchange and how that may escalate tensions on board. Or we're so understaffed now that we have to keep moving just to do our jobs. I don't even have time to deal with that. And so all of them would come to this same conclusion and say, you know, I've just sort of accepted that it's part of the job. And, you know, that was really painful as the president of the Flight Attendant Union to realize that I was in the consciousness of our members' minds. But, so I had to come to terms with that and realize we had to do something about it. Because we had always fought for ourselves, and we had always decided that no one else was going to define who we are. Another story I heard was that a man who's a flight attendant was in the galley on a long international flight, and he turned around and looked out from the cabin in the middle of the service, and he saw this business class traveler reach out and grab his flying partner's rear end. And he got his back up and started to come out of the galley until he saw her whip around, and she said, "You! If you were half as good looking as you think you are, I might think about it, but you're not. So you sit down and don't touch anyone else again." And then she turned around to my flying partner and she said, "And you're a man, I don't need your help, I can take care of myself." But sexual harassment is not about sex, it's about power.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And women have been objectified. This has been a way of keeping us at odds. You know, in our union, we rejected the idea that sex could be traded for schedules by negotiating a seniority list. and we defined our role. But here we were in this Me Too movement moment where we could take it a step further, because the people who built our union, those strong women who built our union, gave us a platform now to go forward, to go farther. And so when we were getting all these stories, I was only getting them from women, I noticed. And I have to tell you, in a job that has been objectified, I have seen men be sexually harassed on the plane. Often, my flying partners, oftentimes, like worse than the women. And so I started asking my fellow flying partners, why are you not speaking up about what you have experienced? We're asking this from everyone. We didn't say women tell us your stories, we said flight attendants tell us your stories. And to a T, what I got back from these brothers who are my flying partners, they said, Sara, we work in a profession that's 80% women. If we're gonna have any power at the bargaining table, we need to make sure that this country recognizes women as equal. This is a moment for women's equality, and we are gonna give every space to let that run and raise that equality, because that's about my bargaining power too. So the bosses have used sexism and racism and homophobia and any difference to try to divide us. They've also tried to define some work as more important than other work. But who has been rising up in the past couple of years?
Women.
It has been women. It has been women-led professions. It has been teachers. It has been hotel workers. It has been grocery workers who have said one job should be enough. Not one good job. One job should be enough. So I want to talk a little bit about power, because I love this story from Atlanta in 1881. We have to recognize that we have power. We have power right now. And we have power by being in this room together and recognizing that our power is not just within ourselves. Our power is recognizing the power that we have in each other and lifting each other up. In 1881, less than 20 years after the Civil War, so-called washerwomen in Atlanta organized a strike for higher pay. Most would have said what they were attempting to do was impossible. There were no labor laws to protect them. There was no single employer with whom they could negotiate, and their low-skilled work could easily be taken over by others. But they wanted a raise to $1 for every 12 pounds of laundry. So they formed what they called the Washing Society and announced their intent to strike if they were not given a raise. They went door to door and spoke at church services, recruiting 3,000 members in 3 weeks. They tapped into a wellspring of support among women like themselves, who worked 7 days a week doing laundry for as little as $4 a month. With their organization growing and their demands generating news coverage, they generated real power. They didn't back down in the face of arrests and massive fines. With creative tactics, the women, most of them former slaves who had only recently begun to work for pay, boxed in the elite families of Atlanta, forcing them to make a decision. Would they grant the pay raises demanded by the women, or hold out the risk of the strike spreading to other domestic workers? And in the meantime, who would do the laundry? Outmaneuvered by the washerwomen, they granted the raises. Now, the law wasn't on the side of these women. The political environment was not favorable to those women. The economy was not in their favor. But they were smart, creative, and fearless. Those women connected with each other and inspired others to take up their cause because they themselves were united first. The strikers were not faceless. They knew the harmony of their voices from singing every verse of Steal Away together on Sunday. They cried together for the children they lost and celebrated the birth of the new babies they cradled. They knew the dreams in each other's hearts and the determination to leave the world better for their children. There was a common story, and when they gathered together in a church in Summerhill to tell it, each woman knew it as her own. They built a movement with their story and encouraged others to tell their versions of it too. They listened, they shared, they took action. They created an organization where none had ever existed and mobilized thousands of their co-workers who knew nothing about collective action. They were smart enough to see that the rich people they worked for would probably pay more rather than face the consequences. They saw in their own community the power they could generate in mobilizing together. And they were fearless in pursuit of what they knew was right in their hearts. Right now, that's exactly what's happening in Chicago as the teachers and support staff of CTU and SEIU are on the line right now, fighting for the schools that children deserve.
Woo.
Thank you. You know, I had the honor of talking to the Mother Jones Foundation on Saturday night, and I have to tell you that, when I've done this work for 20 years, and it was like a shot out of the gate, because 5 years in, 9/11 came. And not only did we have to grieve the loss of our friends, because I was a Boston-based flight attendant, I knew every flight attendant and the customer service agents on Flight 175, the flight that you can see hitting the South Tower because it was caught from so many angles, because American Flight 11 had hit the North Tower 17 minutes earlier. And so we lost our friends. Our profession changed forever. And overnight, 20% of our workforce was furloughed, gone. And then came the bankruptcies. And management took advantage of that moment. We had to fight like hell every step of the way. And so I didn't have time to sit and read a lot of labor history. But one of our union lawyers put Mother Jones' autobiography in my hand and said, if you do nothing else, read this. And it was really all I needed. So I want to share with you this quote from Mother Jones, and then let's talk about the issues that we need to talk about as a labor movement. Because that's what women can do. We don't have to take positions and decide that there are no solutions. Management is always figuring out how to make the most out of a crisis. We have to be smarter than that, and we can. And that's why we're going to lead this movement. The capitalists say there is no need of labor organizing, but the fact that they themselves are continually organizing shows their real beliefs. The capitalists want the most labor for the least money. The laborers want the most money for the least labor. Yes. We want bread and roses too, man. So workers produce wealth and build the world's palaces, but they neither use the wealth nor dwell in the palaces. If you would only realize that you hold the whole solution to the problem in your own hands, you could settle the whole question easily. If, for instance, instead of striking in small groups, every industry in America were to hold up, the capitalists would be obliged to yield to any and all demands, and the world could simply not go on. Now, during the shutdown, we had 800,000 federal workers who were either forced out of work or forced to come to work without pay, and another 1 million contractors who were just off the job with no end in sight. And this White House had no interest in settling that dispute. No interest at all, because what they wanted to do was privatize all functions of government. The postal workers and letter carriers in this office right now know exactly what I'm talking about. They have not hidden this fact. And so when this shutdown was going on, and it was going on and on and on, longer than any shutdown in history, and we were all told that it was about a wall on the southern border with a bunch of fear-mongering and the idea that this nation was deeply divided over that. That was a distraction, that was bullshit.
Woo!
What this was really about was creating a crisis that would allow them to privatize. They hoped
Yes.
that air traffic controllers and transportation security officers would walk off the job, because then the White House would have to rush in and fix it with privatizing. They hoped that there would be a crisis, that there would be an attack, that there would be an accident,
because that accrues power to the executive, and they would be able to rush in and privatize and give more money to their friends on Wall Street.
Yes.
Or they hoped the seed that Ronald Reagan had planted so long ago.
Mm-hmm.
They hoped that the American people would see that nothing happened, and that we don't need our federal sector sisters and brothers. But none of that happened, because federal workers stayed true to the oath that they pledged to all of us. Went to work, denied them that right, went to work under the threat of federal indictments, PATCO-style federal indictments too. And we heard from people all over this country, you know, the federal workers can end this if they just walk off the job. People always want somebody else to fix it. And in our labor movement, we said, hell no, our federal sector sisters and brothers, if they can't do their job, we can't do ours. We've got their backs.
Woo!
And so, it's time to talk about a general strike. Now, that sent shockwaves through labor and politics. And it also defined what was going on here. And it changed the discussion. Because there was no solution in sight here. But we had the solution as labor, and we led the way. And so when those flights stopped in LaGuardia, we said, Mitch McConnell, do you have our attention now? And all of a sudden we had a deal. Now, the capitalists are always organizing. And I think about, you know, what happened after 9/11 and how they took advantage of us. And I think about the climate fight today and how Mother Jones would understand this moment explicitly as well. When she gave that speech that I started with, Mother was storming the country to organize people for not just for a fair wage or safe working conditions. At that time, her biggest goal was to end child labor. It's hard to imagine where we sit today, that just over 100 years ago, children of the working class were sent to factories as young as 6 or 7 years old, some working 14 hours a day for 25 cents a week. And Mother said, let us take the children away from this God-cursed labor and put them